What would you do if your crying baby suddenly stopped screaming? In the arms of a killer, a single mother, a job she couldn't afford to lose, and a man whose hands were still wet with someone else's blood. Solene had made every desperate phone call. The babysitter canceled. No one else could help. So she did the unthinkable. She brought her 11-month-old daughter into the mansion of Chicago's most feared Mafia boss, Stellan Cross. They called him the Phantom, a man who built his empire on the bones of anyone who dared to cross him. A man with a scar running down his face like a death sentence written in flesh. And when he heard the baby crying outside his office, he came for them. But what happened next? No one could have predicted it. Not Solene, not the terrified housekeeper, not even Stellan himself. Because this broken, dangerous man was about to discover something that would change everything. A tiny hand reaching for his, and a smile that would crack open a heart frozen for 20 years. This is a story about finding love in the most unexpected places, about redemption, and about the truth that sometimes the most dangerous hands are the safest place to land. If you've ever believed that monsters can't be saved, this story might just change your mind. Stay until the end, because the moment this baby speaks her first word will leave you in tears. Now, let's begin. Fern's screaming was relentless. The sound echoed off the marble walls of the Cross mansion, feeling like a death sentence that was about to be carried out. "Hush, my baby, please hush," Solene pleaded, her voice breaking. She clutched her daughter to her chest, her work uniform drenched in sweat. Her arms burned from bouncing the 11-month-old for what felt like an eternity, but had only been 40 minutes. Yet nothing could calm her. Nothing ever did when Fern truly began to cry. Mrs. Thornberry materialized at the far end of the hall, her expression a mask of pure panic. "Are you out of your mind?" she hissed. "His office is right there. He can hear every single sound." A cold dread filled Solene's stomach. She knew precisely who he was. Stellan Cross, also known as the Phantom, a man who constructed an empire on the remains of anyone foolish enough to challenge him. She had accepted this job out of sheer, crippling desperation. She was 4 months late on her rent, with medical bills climbing from Fern's premature birth. Her abusive ex-partner had disappeared, leaving her with nothing but fading bruises and mounting debt. She simply had no other choice. "I tried to get someone to watch her," Solene whispered, hot tears stinging her eyes. "The babysitter had to cancel. I have called everybody I know. There is no one else. You are not going to have a life if he—" But the words caught in Mrs. Thornberry's throat. A heavy door slammed shut somewhere deep inside the mansion. Then came the sound of footsteps. They were slow, measured, and drawing closer. "Run," Mrs. Thornberry mouthed silently, before vanishing around a corner as if she were made of smoke. But Solene was frozen. Her legs felt as if they were encased in concrete. All she could do was stand there, holding her wailing child, as she watched Stellan Cross come around the corner and stop. He was much taller than she had pictured, with a broader frame. A wicked scar ran down the left side of his face, from his temple all the way to his jaw, a pale line against his skin. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake and held just as much life. He was dressed in a black suit that likely cost more than Solene made in an entire year. Then she saw it. Blood. There was fresh blood staining his knuckles. His voice was a low rumble, more terrifying than any shout. Solene flinched. It felt as if he had screamed at her. "I am so sorry, sir. I understand I should not have brought her here. The nanny had a family emergency, and I could not find a replacement, and I cannot afford to lose this job. My daughter, she needs her medicine, and I—" "Stop talking." Solene's mouth snapped shut. Fern, however, kept wailing, her small body shaking with the intensity of her cries. Stellan's cold gaze shifted down to the baby. An unreadable emotion flickered across his face. "How old is she?" he asked. 11 months, sir. She was born prematurely. She was in the neonatal intensive care unit for 2 months. She does not like being around new people. She will not let anyone but me hold her. Even doctors have to give her something to calm her down for an examination. She is afraid of everyone. I am explaining this to you because... Stellan reached his hand out toward Fern. Celine's heart stopped beating. Sir, please do not. She will only scream louder. It will make things worse. I am begging you. Just allow me to leave, and I promise I will never bring her here again. I will find another solution. Suddenly Fern's crying ceased. The abrupt quiet was so profound that Celine completely forgot how to breathe. Her daughter's head lifted from her shoulder. Her large blue eyes, still glistening with tears, fixed on Stellan Cross, with a focus that made no sense at all. And then, Fern smiled. Celine had not once seen her daughter smile at a person she did not know. Not a single time in 11 months. But Fern was smiling now, extending both of her arms toward this man, making little grasping motions with her tiny fingers. No, Celine whispered in disbelief. Baby, no! Fern whined and began to squirm, struggling to get to Stellan. Her small body strained forward, her hands opening and closing with desperation. She wanted to be held by him. This monster, this dangerous man. Her daughter wanted him. Give her to me, Stellan commanded. Sir, no, I... Celine did not understand why she obeyed. Perhaps it was the fear. Perhaps it was the strange authority in his voice. Or perhaps it was the way Fern was looking at him, as if he were the only truly safe place in the entire world. She placed her child into the arms of Chicago's most feared man. And Fern, her screaming, impossible to console, afraid of everyone baby girl, immediately wrapped her arms around Stellan Cross's neck. She let out a long sigh of absolute contentment. The Mafia boss stood there, completely still. His blood-stained hand hovered in the air near the baby's back, uncertain. His cold eyes had grown wide. For one unbelievable moment, he looked almost like a normal person. She has never, ever done that before, Celine breathed out, not with anyone. Stellan remained silent. He just stood there, holding this small, delicate life against his broad chest, looking like someone who had just been handed something precious that he did not know how to handle. If this moment sent a shiver down your spine, go ahead and hit that like button. Share this story with a friend who appreciates an unexpected plot twist, and make sure you subscribe because you will not want to miss what Stellan does next. Sometimes the most dangerous hands are the safest place to land. Stellan turned and walked away, not waiting to see Soline's reaction. Fern still had her little arms wrapped around him. Tightly around his neck, her blue eyes were closed, and her breathing was even, as if she had discovered the most secure place in the universe. Celine stood motionless for a second, and then another, her brain failing to comprehend what she had just witnessed. Her feet started moving before her mind could catch up, following the man who held her daughter as if it were the most ordinary thing imaginable. They proceeded down a long, cavernous hallway, past priceless oil paintings that adorned the walls and perfectly arranged floral displays. Every one of Stellan's footsteps landed with quiet confidence on the marble floor. Every one of Celine's steps trembled just behind him. The large double oak doors swung open, and Celine found herself in an entirely new reality. Stellan Cross's office was as large as the entire rundown apartment she called home. The ceiling was incredibly high, adorned with a magnificent crystal chandelier. Windows stretched from the floor to the ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the entire city of Chicago. The skyscrapers glittered like a forest made of diamonds against the night sky. The walnut floor was buffed to such a high shine that Celine could see her own distorted reflection in it. A huge black mahogany desk was positioned in the middle of the room, holding only a sleek laptop and an old-fashioned brass lamp. A massive bookshelf dominated one entire wall, packed with leather-bound books that appeared to have never been touched. But it was not the opulence that stole Celine's breath. In one corner of the office was a glass cabinet that reached from the floor nearly to the ceiling. Displayed inside, arranged meticulously on black velvet stands, were at least 20 different firearms. There were handguns, rifles, and other weapons she could not even identify. They shone under the lights, maintained with the kind of care reserved for priceless art. Celine swallowed nervously. This was his reality, a world of violence, weapons, and death, and her daughter was sleeping soundly in the arms of the man who commanded it all. "Sit down," Stellan commanded, motioning with his chin toward a black leather chair. The chair was positioned opposite his desk. Celine sat down. She felt she had no other option. Stellan moved around the desk, his one arm still securely supporting Fern, before he settled into his own large chair. He repositioned the child with a cautiousness that was strangely tender. He let her head rest against his shoulder, his large hand covering almost all of Fern's small back. The dried blood on his knuckles smudged against the fabric of his expensive suit. He did not appear to notice or care. Stellan's cold, gray eyes fixed on Celine. Under the office lighting, the scar on his face was even more visible. It was a jagged, brutal line running from his temple to his jaw, telling a violent story she dared not even try to imagine. His voice remained calm and still terrifying. "You will now explain to me why you believed bringing a child into my home was an acceptable decision." Celine took a shaky breath. She was aware she should invent a lie. She should create a story that sounded less pathetic, but those gray eyes were staring right into her soul. It felt as though they could see every single thought inside her mind. And she understood that lying to this particular man would be the very last mistake she would ever make. "My daughter's babysitter called me at 5 o'clock this morning," she started, her voice sounding hoarse. Her mother had suffered a stroke. She needed to get on a plane to Florida right away. I made 17 different phone calls. 17. Not one person could help me. "Why?" Stellan interrupted, his gaze never wavering. "Why was there no one who could assist you?" "Because I have no one," Celine admitted, hearing her own voice crack. "My parents were killed in a car crash when I was 16. I do not have any brothers or sisters, no other family. My friends walked away a long time ago because—" She trailed off. "Because of what?" "Because of my ex-boyfriend." Celine stared down at her hands, which were clenched together in her lap. "He did not like it when I had friends. He did not like it when I spoke to anyone else. He did not like me doing anything that he had not approved of." A tense silence filled the room. When Celine finally looked up, she noticed that something in Stellan's eyes had shifted. They were still cold, still impossible to read, but different. But a shadow followed them. Something menacing. "He hit you." It was not a question, but a declaration. Celine gave a small nod, a knot forming in her throat. "For 2 years, I was too afraid to leave because he swore he would end my life. Then, I learned I was pregnant." She cast a look at Fern, her daughter, who was still sound asleep on Stellan's shoulder, completely oblivious to the agonizing past her mother was now revealing. "He assaulted me when I was 7 months along. He beat me so terribly that I ended up in the hospital. She was born 2 months premature. She weighed less than 2 kilograms. The doctors told me she might not make it." Soline's voice cracked with the memory. Fern was in an incubator for 62 days. For 62 agonizing days, I sat right there beside her, pleading, begging anyone in the heavens or on earth to please let her live. And while all of that was going on, he vanished. He left me holding all his gambling debts, which were in my name. He left me with the mountain of hospital bills. He left me in an apartment with 4 months of unpaid rent. Tears streamed down Celine's face, but she made no move to wipe them away. She was far too exhausted to even try to hold on to her dignity. Fern's immune system is incredibly fragile because she was born so early. She requires medication. She requires constant doctor visits. She needs so many things I cannot give her. I was let go from 3 different jobs because I needed to take days off to look after her whenever she got sick. This position, she lifted her head, her eyes meeting Stellan's directly. This position was my very last hope. If I am fired, my daughter and I will be living on the streets. So yes, I understood that bringing her here was a reckless thing to do. I knew exactly who you are. I knew you could kill me for simply causing you an inconvenience, but I was out of options. When my choices were a definite firing or a possibility of being killed, I took the possibility, because at least with that, there was a tiny glimmer of hope. Celine went quiet, her breaths coming in short, rapid bursts. She had revealed too much. She was sure of it, but once the words started, they wouldn't stop. Everything she had kept locked inside for nearly 2 whole years burst forth like a collapsing dam. The office was swallowed by an intense silence. Stellan did not say a word. He just observed her with an unreadable expression on his face. One of his arms still cradled Fern, and his thumb was subconsciously stroking the child's small back. Fern shifted in her sleep, letting out a faint murmur, and then her little arms tightened around Stellan's neck. Celine witnessed it for just a fraction of a second. Stellan's intense gaze softened as he looked down at the little girl in his arms, just for an instant before the icy hardness returned. "What is his name?" Stellan demanded, his voice lowering into something truly frightening. "The man who did this to you. What is his name?" Celine went rigid. She understood immediately that his question was not driven by simple curiosity. It was a vow of violence, of retribution, of awful things that would happen if she gave him an answer. Celine shook her head. "It is not important," she said in a rush. "He is gone. I have no idea where he is, and I have no desire to find out." Stellan examined her for a very long moment, his gray eyes as sharp as daggers. Celine had the disquieting feeling that he did not believe her, or at the very least, that he understood she was concealing something. But he did not push her for more information. Not at that moment. He rose to his feet, still holding Fern, as if the child was as light as a feather pillow. He moved over to the window, staring out at the glittering cityscape far below. Fern stirred again, her head moving to find a more comfortable spot on his shoulder before she settled back into a deep sleep. Stellan remained there in complete silence for almost a minute. Celine was afraid to move a muscle. She was afraid to even breathe. She just sat there, waiting for him to pass judgment. Fired, or something much worse. She had braced herself for either outcome. "You and the child will be moving in here." Celine was absolutely convinced she had heard him wrong. "What was that you said?" "There is an apartment located in the east wing of my estate," Stellan explained, his back still to her. "2 bedrooms, completely furnished. You will move in this afternoon." Celine jumped to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sir, I am confused. What exactly are you saying?" "I am saying that you will live here." Stellan turned to face her, his expression as cold as marble. "I will also hire a professional nanny to look after the child during your work hours. I will handle all of her medical expenses, and you will no longer have to be concerned about paying rent." The room began to tilt around Celine. Nothing about this situation was logical. Men like Stellan Cross never offered help to anyone without a motive, without some kind of cost. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Why would you do all of this? You know absolutely nothing about me. I am just a cleaner. I cannot understand why you would do this." "It is because of the child," Stellan interrupted, his eyes falling to Fern. "She trusts me. She has no reason to trust me. Nobody should ever trust me. And yet, she does." He paused for a beat, his thumb still stroking the child's back without conscious thought. "That is not a feeling I am familiar with." Celine had no idea what to say. She just stood there, watching the most feared man in all of Chicago hold her little girl with a tenderness she had never witnessed from anyone, not even from the child's own biological father. "But I cannot accept your offer." She finally managed to say, "I refuse to be indebted to you. I do not want to. This is not an offer you can refuse." Stellan took a step closer, and Celine had to fight the urge to retreat. He came to a stop directly in front of her, his large frame towering over her by almost a foot, casting a dark shadow over her. "You do not possess the right to say no." Celine's anger flared despite her terror. "Then what does that make me?" she challenged, her voice coming out stronger than she had meant it to. A piece in your personal game? Just something you can purchase with your money? I am not. You are a mother who is starving herself so that her daughter has enough to eat, Stellan countered, his voice like shards of ice. You are a woman getting by on 3 hours of sleep a night because you are forced to work 2 different jobs. You are someone who is brave enough to stand right here before me, before death itself, because you were left with no other path. He tilted his head, his eyes scrutinizing her. I am not purchasing you. I am providing you with a lifeline. It is your choice whether you accept it. But if you decline this out of some misplaced pride while your daughter is in desperate need of medicine, then you are far more contemptible than the men I have put in the ground. His words hit Soline like a physical blow. She wanted to yell at him, to tell him she did not need his charity. But just then, Fern stirred, making a small, contented sound in her sleep, and every last ounce of pride inside Soline crumbled into dust. She gazed at her daughter, so fragile, so pale and small, perpetually sick, because Soline could not pay for the proper treatments. The child who slept on a thin blanket on the floor of a cold apartment because Soline could not pay for the heating. The child who deserved so much more than Soline could ever provide. Very well, Soline whispered, her voice finally breaking. I will stay. For Fern's sake. Only for her. Stellan nodded once, as if he had expected this exact result all along. Mrs. Thornberry will show you to the apartment, he stated. Your things will be brought over within the next 2 hours. The new nanny is scheduled to begin tomorrow. He glanced down at Fern one last time, and for a fleeting instant, Soline saw a hint of softness flicker in those frigid eyes. And now, he said, let the child rest. She appears to like it here. The apartment was not really an apartment. It was a fantasy Soline would never have allowed herself to imagine. Mrs. Thornberry opened a solid oak door, and Soline had to grip the wall to keep her legs from giving out. The living room was enormous, with cream-colored velvet couches, plush fur carpets, and massive windows that looked out onto the estate's flawlessly kept gardens. The open-plan kitchen had a refrigerator that was completely stocked with food, the kind of food Soline had not been able to buy in many months. Fresh fruit, whole milk, cuts of beef. She had to avert her gaze so Mrs. Thornberry would not see the tears welling in her eyes. The main bedroom featured a large double bed with immaculate white linens and a feather comforter so fluffy that Soline wanted to collapse onto it and weep. But it was the other room that completely shattered her composure. Fern's room. The walls were a soft mint green, adorned with hand-painted butterflies and flowers that seemed to flutter around the window. A white crib with a thick cushioned mattress and soft blankets was situated in the corner. The shelves were overflowing with stuffed animals, vibrant stacking toys, and soft cloth books for a baby. The closet door opened to show rows upon rows of tiny clothes, dresses, rompers, socks, and hats, every single item brand new, and all of them in Fern's exact size. He had all of this prepared, Mrs. Thornberry explained, her voice sounding much warmer than Soline had ever heard it. Within 2 hours. Soline stood there in the center of the room, tears now streaming unchecked down her face. She thought about her old apartment, where Fern had to sleep on a thin mat on the bare floor, where Soline would pile 3 worn-out blankets on top of her child because she could not afford to turn on the heat. She thought about the long nights she spent awake, listening to her daughter cry from the biting cold, feeling like the most inadequate mother on the planet. And now she was here, in this room, surrounded by this warmth. She had no idea what she was meant to feel. Was it gratitude, or was it fear? It was probably both. A knock on the door startled Soline out of her thoughts. She quickly wiped her eyes and went to open. A woman of Asian descent stood on the threshold. She appeared to be in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, and her expression was serene, but her eyes were as sharp as surgical steel. She was dressed in a plain black outfit, but her posture, the way she scanned her surroundings, projected an unusual air of authority. I am Miss Hayashi, she introduced herself, her voice both gentle and resolute. I will be serving as Fern's nanny, starting tomorrow. Mr. Cross requested that I come and introduce myself to you first. Celine ushered her inside, still trying to get a sense of this woman. Miss Hayashi stepped into the apartment with the fluid grace of a predator, her gaze sweeping over every corner as if she were assessing for threats. Do you have a lot of experience with children? Celine inquired. I have a great deal of experience with many things, Miss Hayashi answered, a slight smile forming on her lips. You have no reason to be concerned. Fern will be perfectly safe with me. The particular emphasis she placed on the word safe sent a shiver down Celine's spine, not of fear, but of the dawning realization that Miss Hayashi was certainly not just a nanny. That evening, after she had fed Fern and laid her down in the new crib, Celine was lying in the bed, completely unable to fall asleep. The entire situation still felt like a dream. Just that morning, she had been a cleaner about to lose her only job. That night, she was resting on bed sheets with a thread count so high she could not even guess the number. A quiet noise caused her to sit up immediately, listening to the footsteps just outside her apartment door. Celine slid silently out of the bed and crept toward the door. She did not dare to open it. She just peered through the peephole, and her heart nearly stopped. Stellan Cross was standing right outside her door. He did not knock on it. He did not move at all. He just stood there in the dimly lit hallway, looking at her door with an expression she could not possibly decipher. One of his hands lifted, as if he was about to knock, but then it dropped back to his side, then lifted once more. He stood like a statue for nearly 5 minutes before he finally turned around and vanished into the dark corridor. Celine leaned her back against the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had absolutely no idea what this man wanted from her. She just did not know why he had appeared outside her room in the dead of night. But she was certain of one thing. Her entire world was about to change forever. The first week felt like an unreal, strange dream. Celine found she was not sure she ever wanted to wake up from it. Her duties were completely transformed. She no longer scrubbed floors or polished glass doors. Thornbury gave her a small desk in the office area where she now organized documents, handled correspondence, and began to understand the complex machinery of the Cross estate. The job was not physically hard, but it demanded her complete and total concentration. Every single piece of paper might contain a secret. Every name could be a life story. She quickly learned to avoid asking questions, to never stare for too long, and to suppress her curiosity about the meetings happening behind Stellan's closed office doors. But the work was not what occupied her thoughts. It was the evenings. Every single night at precisely 7 o'clock, never a minute early or a minute late, a knock would sound at her door. And when Celine answered, Stellan Cross would be standing there. He offered no explanation. He never asked for her permission. He would just walk inside, go directly to Fern, and take a seat next to her. For 15 minutes, exactly 15 minutes each evening. On the first night, Celine stood frozen in a corner, tense and on guard. She had no idea what she should do. She did not know what she should say, but Fern knew exactly what to do. The instant the little girl saw Stellan, her blue eyes brightened with joy. She crawled toward him as quickly as her tiny legs could carry her, with her arms reaching out, asking to be held. And Stellan, known as the most ruthless mafia boss in all of Chicago, would bend down and lift her into his arms as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Fern would wrap her arms around his neck, letting her head rest on his shoulder while making small, contented sounds. Stellan spoke very little. He might ask if she was eating enough, or if she was sleeping well, brief questions aimed at Celine while his gaze remained fixed on Fern. Then he would simply sit there holding the child, allowing Fern to play with his necktie or pat his cheek with her small hand. On the third evening, Fern drifted off to sleep on Stellan's shoulder. He remained perfectly still for 20 minutes, not making a single move, not even daring to breathe too deeply, terrified he might wake her. When he eventually placed Fern into her crib, his actions were so delicate. Celine could not comprehend that these were the very same hands that had ended lives. Whispers began to spread through the estate like a wildfire. Celine overheard them in hushed talks in the kitchen and saw them in the shocked expressions she received when she walked by. He goes to see the child every night. One of the staff members said, I just can't believe it. Whose child is she that he cares this much? Surely not his. Another person answered, just the cleaner's infant. But that little girl holds on to him as if he were her own father. Mrs. Thornberry was the only person who showed no surprise at all. In my 20 years of service to the Cross family, I have never seen him act this way, she explained to Celine on the 5th day while they were organizing files in the records room. He does not like children. He does not like anyone getting too close to him. But Fern, she just shook her head, her face a mix of confusion and wonder. That little girl has some effect on him. I cannot explain what it is, but he is a different man around her. Celine did not know what to say in return. She had noticed the transformation as well. During the evenings when Stellan sat with Fern, his entire expression would soften. It was not much, only a subtle change. But it was enough for Celine to catch a glimpse of the person hidden behind the icy facade. It was enough for her to begin questioning who he truly was. On the 7th night, as Stellan was getting ready to depart, Fern started to weep. She grabbed onto his jacket, unwilling to let him go, as tears streamed down her pudgy cheeks. Stellan stood there completely helpless, staring down at the crying little girl with a look Celine had never witnessed on his face before. It was a mixture of confusion and pain, as if Fern's sobs were tearing something essential apart inside of him. I will be back, he said to the child, his voice sounding more coarse than it normally did. Tomorrow, I give you my word. Fern could not understand his words, but she clearly understood his tone. She stopped crying, let out a hiccup once or twice, and then she lifted her hand to touch his cheek. Stellan shut his eyes for just a moment, but that single moment conveyed more than words ever could. After he was gone that night, Celine lingered by the window, watching his silhouette disappear down the hallway. She replayed what Mrs. Thornberry had said about the change in him, about the man who existed behind the Mafia boss. And for the very first time since arriving there, she experienced an emotion besides fear, something infinitely more perilous. It was curiosity. On the 9th night, Celine's deepest fear became a reality. She was jolted awake at 2 in the morning by a faint cry coming from the other room. It was not Fern's typical cry for attention. This sound was entirely different. It was a whimper of pain. Celine threw herself out of bed and rushed into her daughter's room, and her heart plunged into a cold abyss. Fern was lying in her crib, her face a deep shade of red, her hair completely soaked with sweat. When Celine touched her forehead, she nearly let out a scream. Hot! She was burning up. No, 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 Celine whispered again and again, her hands trembling, as she picked up her child. Fern cried out weakly, her head lolling against her mother's chest, her little body shaking uncontrollably. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, and every single breath felt like a sharp knife twisting inside Celine's heart. She had witnessed this before, in the intensive care unit right after Fern was born. She remembered the doctors rushing around with expressions of concern they tried to conceal. A compromised immune system. That was their warning. A common fever for a normal child could be a death sentence for Fern. Celine hugged her daughter even tighter, tears pouring down her cheeks. She had no money to call for an ambulance. She had no health insurance. She had absolutely no one. You are going to be okay, she murmured, unsure if she was trying to comfort Fern or herself. Mommy will figure something out. Mommy will. Suddenly, the bedroom door was thrown open. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. Stellan Cross was standing in the doorway, his hair a mess, his shirt creased as if he had just jumped out of bed. His gray eyes scanned the room, landing on Fern, and a dangerous light ignited within them. What is wrong? His voice was as sharp as a razor. She has a fever, Celine managed to say, her voice cracking with emotion. A very high fever. I have no idea what to do. I have no money for a doctor. I do not have anything. Stellan took out his phone before she could say another word. He dialed a number and spoke just 5 words. Get over here right now. Then he ended the call and walked toward Celine. Give her to me. Celine did not hesitate for a second. She placed Fern into his strong arms and almost instantly, the child stopped crying. Her breathing was still fast. She was still burning with fever, but she was no longer crying, as if just being held in Stellan's arms made the pain tolerable. The doctor will arrive in 15 minutes, Stellan stated, his gaze fixed on Fern. He is my personal physician, the very best in Chicago. She is going to be fine. He said it like a command, as if he were ordering the universe itself not to dare harm this child. 12 minutes later, a man in his middle years came in carrying a medical bag. He examined Fern with quick professionalism, prescribed some medicine, and explained how to bring the fever down, a mild respiratory infection. He said, "It would not be serious for a typical child, but given her immune system, she requires very close observation. I will come back in the morning." After the doctor departed, Celine released a shaky breath of relief, but Stellan did not leave. He sat down in the chair next to Fern's crib, still holding the child in his arms, and then he looked directly at Celine. "Go get some sleep," he ordered. "I will watch over her." Celine just shook her head. "I cannot possibly sleep. She is sick. I need to be here." "You have to rest," Stellan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for disagreement. "You are on the verge of collapsing. You will be no help to her if you also become ill." She wanted to argue with him, but she knew he was right. She was completely exhausted and utterly terrified. She had not slept well in months or even in years. And now, watching Stellan sit there holding Fern, his face serious and focused, she felt a sensation she had not experienced in a very long time. She felt safe. She did not leave the room. She simply could not. Instead, she slid down to the floor, resting her back against the wall, and let sleep claim her while Stellan watched over her daughter. When her eyes opened again, the first pale light of dawn was filtering through the curtains. Stellan remained in the exact same position. He had not moved an inch. All through the night, Fern had slept soundly against his chest. Her breathing was even now, and a healthy color had returned to her face. Stellan, with dark circles of exhaustion under his eyes, gazed down at the child with an expression Celine could not quite decipher. It was tender, fiercely protective, yet also pained, as if he were looking at something beautiful that he knew he could never deserve. "Do not give up, little one," he murmured, unaware that Celine was awake. "You are so much stronger than you know. You must be stronger than you know." His voice cracked for a fleeting second before he regained his composure, and Celine, sitting there in the quiet, felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She was no longer crying out of fear. She was crying because she had just seen something few others ever would, the fracturing heart of Stellan Cross. Fern made a full recovery in 3 days. Over those 3 days, Stellan visited not just once, but twice each day, in the morning and evening, to personally check on the little girl's progress. For those 3 long days, his personal physician was constantly available, providing costly medicines Celine knew she could never afford on her own. And throughout those 3 days, she found herself looking at this formidable man with completely new eyes. On the 4th day, with Fern smiling and playing once more, Stellan called Celine to his office. She stood before his desk, her spine held perfectly straight, willing herself to project a calm she did not feel as her heart hammered against her ribs. She had no idea what he wanted from her. Perhaps he had grown weary of their arrangement. Perhaps he wanted her to leave. "You are observant," Stellan stated suddenly, slicing right through her anxious thoughts. Celine blinked in confusion. "Sir?" "Yesterday, when the doctor was examining Fern, you were standing in the corner," Stellan said, rising from his chair to walk toward the window, presenting his back to her. "What did you observe?" Celine did not immediately grasp his question, but she carefully replayed the scene in her mind. The doctor checking on Fern, her own anxious watching, and the small details she had registered. He was nervous, she said slowly, choosing her words with care. Not about Fern. He was worried about something else entirely. He kept looking at his watch. She paused. His hand was trembling just a little when he wrote out the prescription, and as he was leaving, he glanced toward the main gate, like he was afraid someone might be waiting for him outside. Stellan turned around, his gray eyes as sharp as blades. What else? Celine hesitated for a moment before continuing. His phone buzzed 3 times during the examination. He ignored the calls, but his eyes darted toward the door after each one. And the very last time, I saw him swallow hard, as if he was truly frightened. A heavy silence filled the room. Stellan observed her with an unreadable expression. Then he gave a slight nod, a thin smile touching his lips. That doctor has significant gambling debts, he explained. Loan sharks are applying pressure. I learned this last week, but you figured it out in 10 minutes. Celine was unsure how to reply. She just remained still, waiting for him to continue. You are intelligent, Stellan went on, taking a step closer to her. You managed to survive 2 years with a man who hurt you. You have raised a child on your own with absolutely nothing. You stood your ground in front of me when everyone else on this estate is terrified. He came to a stop directly in front of her, close enough for her to see the hard lines of his face and the faint scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw. I require an assistant, he stated. Not the type who merely organizes paperwork. I need someone who can read people, who can sense a threat before it materializes, someone who can think clearly under extreme pressure. The room seemed to spin for a moment. You want me to be your assistant? I will personally train you, Stellan said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. You will learn to interpret body language, to spot deception, to analyze complex situations. You will attend meetings with me and report what you see. Your pay will be 5 times what you make now, and Fern will have absolutely everything she could ever need. Celine's instinct was to refuse. She wanted to tell him she had no desire to get pulled any deeper into his dangerous world. But then she thought about Fern. She thought of the sleepless nights when her child was sick, and of the precarious future that awaited them if Celine remained powerless. And she thought of Stellan, the powerful man who had stayed awake the entire night holding her daughter. The man who had whispered to Fern as if she were the most precious being on earth. All right, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. I accept. Stellan nodded once, as if he had never doubted what her answer would be. We will begin tomorrow. As Celine walked out of the office, she knew with absolute certainty that she had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. 2 weeks passed in a blur of intensive lessons and detailed observation. Stellan instructed Celine on how to decode body language, how to notice the most subtle tells of a lie, and how to distinguish between simple fear and someone concealing something much more sinister. He had her review recordings of his previous business meetings, demanding she analyze every individual present. She absorbed everything quickly, learning even faster than he had anticipated. So, in the 3rd week, he decided it was time to test her skills in a real-world scenario. The meeting was held in the estate's formal conference room. 5 men were seated around a long, polished mahogany table. There was a real estate developer from New York, accompanied by his 2 lawyers, and 2 other men Celine did not know but immediately sensed were representing some other kind of powerful organization. She took a seat in the corner of the room with a notepad, having been introduced only as Mr. Cross's new secretary. Nobody gave her a second glance. This was precisely what Stellan had intended. Celine observed quietly as the developer, a middle-aged man named Morrison in a very expensive suit with an overly eager smile, began his presentation on a luxury housing project planned for the Chicago suburbs. He spoke confidently about figures, profit margins, and his long-term vision. His delivery was as smooth as silk, but Celine noticed other, more telling things. Morrison would moisten his lips each time he brought up investment numbers, a classic sign of anxiety. His eyes consistently shifted to the right when he discussed projected earnings, a common indicator of fabrication rather than memory. The most revealing sign of all was his right hand, which repeatedly touched the collar of his shirt, a self-comforting gesture frequently seen when a person is being dishonest. The two unknown men were a stark contrast. They sat perfectly still, their gaze locked on Stellan, showing zero interest in the property details. They were not there to discuss real estate. They were present to evaluate and to observe, and they were clearly far more dangerous than Morrison. The meeting concluded after 1 hour and 30 minutes. Stellan gave no commitment, saying only that he would review the proposal and contact them later. Once everyone else had departed, he shut the conference room door and turned his attention to Celine. Proceed. Celine took a steadying breath. Morrison is lying, she stated, her voice more confident than she felt. He is lying about the investment figures and the projected profits. He displays clear signs of anxiety whenever money is discussed. I believe his project is in serious financial trouble. He has probably already lost key investors and is now desperate to secure new funding. Stellan remained silent, his expression just watching her. His lawyers are aware he is lying, Celine pressed on. They refuse to make eye contact whenever he inflates the numbers, but they remain silent because they are paid to protect him, not to reveal the truth. And the other two men? Stellan prompted. Celine took a brief pause. They have no interest in the real estate deal. Their purpose was to assess you. They watched your every move throughout the entire meeting, gauging how you reacted, how you spoke, and how you deferred your decision. I do not know who they are, but they are dangerous men. The one with the salt and pepper hair is especially so. He watched you as if he were actively searching for a vulnerability. Silence hung in the air. Stellan regarded her with an inscrutable look. Then, he did something so unexpected it almost made Celine stumble. He smiled. It was not the cold or mocking smirk she was used to, but a genuine smile. It was fleeting, but it was powerful enough to completely change his scarred face. Morrison is on the verge of declaring bankruptcy, he confirmed. He lost 2 of his major investors last month. He is utterly desperate. And the other 2 men are emissaries from a Detroit Mafia family. They are trying to decide whether to propose an alliance or to start a war. You analyzed the situation perfectly. A surge of relief and quiet pride washed through Celine, but she kept her composure. I had a very good teacher, she replied, her tone deliberately neutral. Stellan gazed at her for a long moment, his eyes containing an emotion Celine did not dare to identify. You are a single mother, he said, his voice low. You learned to read people because your very survival depended on it. That is why you are so good at this. That is the reason I chose you. As he turned to leave, Celine felt her heart begin to beat much faster than before. It was not a rhythm of fear, but of something else entirely. Something she understood she should not be feeling for this man. 1 month went by, and Celine settled into the new cadence of her life. She grew familiar with the high-stakes meetings, with the constant analysis of people and their motives, with Stellan's steady presence, and with the particular way he would look at her after she delivered an accurate assessment, including those brief, charged moments when their gazes held for just a second too long, but she never, ever grew accustomed to moments like this one. That evening, Celine got back to her apartment much later than usual. A difficult meeting with an investment firm from Los Angeles had extended until almost 10 o'clock at night, and a deep exhaustion had settled into her bones. All she wanted was to fall into bed. But as she gently pushed open the apartment door, she heard it. A low, warm, singing voice, floating softly from the direction of Fern's bedroom. Celine stopped in her tracks. She recognized that voice instantly. She had heard it command rooms full of powerful men. She had heard it turn to ice when dealing with his enemies. She had heard it soften when he spoke directly to Fern. But she had never heard it sound quite like this. She moved without a sound toward her daughter's room, each step feeling strangely weightless. The door was slightly ajar, and through the small gap, she witnessed a scene that made her heart stand still. Stellan was sitting in the rocking chair next to Fern's crib, holding the sleeping child securely in his arms. The gentle yellow glow from the nightlight enveloped them both like a soft, protective veil, making them seem a world away. And he was singing a song in Italian. Celine could not understand the lyrics, but she did not have to. The melody communicated everything she needed to know. It was a lullaby, sorrowful and beautiful, and overflowing with love. Stellan's voice was not perfect, a little strained on the higher notes, but it was filled with something Celine had never detected from him before. There was tenderness, a deep vulnerability, and a sense of longing. Fern had been asleep for quite some time. Her breathing was steady, her lips were slightly parted, and one of her tiny hands was clutching Stellan's finger. But he did not stop singing. He continued his song, with his eyes closed, as if the music was not just for the child, but for someone else, someone who was long gone. Celine stood perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. Tears were streaming down her face before she was even aware she was crying. She was not crying out of sadness. She was crying because she was observing something sacred, something she believed no one else had ever been allowed to see, the unguarded soul of Stellan Cross. The song concluded on a long, quiet note. Stellan opened his eyes, and in that fleeting moment, before he could put his walls back up, Celine saw it all. A pain that was deep and ancient, a wound that had never healed. Then he noticed that she was there. His eyes locked with hers through the small opening of the door, and they both went completely still. Celine expected him to be furious, expected him to get up and leave without saying anything, just as he always did whenever anyone got too close. But he did not do that. He just stared at her, and his gray eyes softened in the dim light in a way she had never witnessed before. "My mother used to sing me that song," he said, his voice quiet and raspy, every single night until she was no longer able to sing. Celine pushed the door fully open and walked into the room, her legs moving as if they had their own mind. She sank to the floor next to his chair, so close that she could have reached out and touched him. "When did she pass away?" she asked in a soft voice. "When I was 12, Stellan looked down at Fern, his fingers gently stroking the child's fine hair without him realizing it. "My father murdered her. He beat her to death right in front of my eyes." A cold dread washed over Celine. She struggled to find words, but none came. No phrase could possibly touch a pain so deep. Stellan's voice seemed to echo from a great distance as he continued. "I tried to stop him. I was only 12 years old, and I fought to push him away, but I lacked the strength. The only thing I could do was hold her as her life slipped away. And that song was the last thing she ever sang for me." Celine's tears flowed freely now. She made no attempt to hold them back. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I am so incredibly sorry." Stellan met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw an emotion she was afraid to identify. "You were never meant to see this part of me," he said. "No one was." "And why is that?" "Because it could make someone mistake me for a good man," he answered with a raw bitterness. "I am not a good man, Celine. I am a monster. I have taken more lives than you could possibly comprehend." Celine looked directly at him, into those dark, haunted eyes, and spoke the truth as she saw it. "Fern does not believe you are a monster. She looks at you as if you are her entire world. Children possess an instinct about people. They are never mistaken." Stellan did not respond. He simply held her gaze for a long, stretched-out moment that felt like an eternity. Then, he did something that made Celine's heart catch in her throat. He raised his hand and gently brushed the tears from her cheek. His touch was careful and tender, as if he were holding something incredibly fragile. "You are crying as well," he said, his voice soft. "You are the first person to shed a tear for me in over 20 years." And in that instant, sitting on the floor of her daughter's room with Stellan's fingers still resting on her skin, Celine knew she loved him. The realization was stunning. She loved the monster, and she had no idea what to do with this truth. They remained in silence for a long while after that. Stellan eventually lowered his hand, but he did not get up. He did not leave as Celine had expected. Instead, his gaze fell to Fern, the child still sleeping peacefully in his arms, and he started to speak again. His voice was quiet and remote, as if he was reliving a memory from far away. "I had a sister," he began. "Her name was Thistle." Celine held her breath, afraid that the slightest movement or sound would make him stop. She knew, with a deep certainty, that he had never shared this with another soul. "She was born the year I turned 12, Stellan went on, his eyes remaining on Fern. "It was the same year my mother died. My mother gave birth to Thistle only 3 months before my father took her life. I think that was his reason. He was consumed by jealousy. He was jealous that our mother's love for us was greater than her love for him." He paused for a moment, his jaw clenching. Celine could see the muscles in his face tense as he fought for composure. "After our mother was gone, I was the one who raised Thistle," he said. "My father showed no interest. He was too consumed with building his criminal empire, with killing people and destroying lives. So at 12 years old, I learned how to change diapers and mix formula. I learned how to rock a crying baby back to sleep. I sang my mother's song to her every single night. I swore to her that I would always protect her, that I would never let any harm come to her." His voice cracked on the last words. Fresh tears streamed down Celine's face, but she let them fall. She sat perfectly still, listening, acting as a witness to the profound sorrow he had shouldered for 2 decades. "Thistle grew up," Stellan continued, a sad, bitter smile touching his lips. "She had my mother's same blue eyes. She was always smiling. She had a trusting heart and saw the good in everyone, even those who did not deserve it. She was so much like Fern." He glanced down at the little girl in his arms, and Celine saw something inside him completely shatter. "So much like her that at times it feels hard to breathe." "What happened to her?" Celine asked, her voice barely a whisper. Stellan's eyes closed tightly. "When Thistle was 5 years old, my father started a war with a rival Mafia family. He believed he was invincible. He was mistaken. They came for us in the middle of the night. I was 17. I was on the lower floor when the sound of gunfire erupted. I immediately ran toward Thistle's room, but he trailed off. When he opened his eyes again, they were gleaming with tears." Celine had never witnessed him cry. She had not thought him capable of it. "I did not get there in time," he confessed, his voice breaking like fragile glass. She was on her bed, and there was blood covering everything. Her eyes were still open, looking toward the doorway as if she was expecting me to burst in and save her. But I failed her. I made a promise to protect her, and I broke it. Tears now rolled freely down Stellan's cheeks, and he made no move to wipe them away. He just sat there, clutching Fern, weeping in silence for the sister he had lost 20 years before. "I held her for the entire night," he continued, his voice sounding distant once more. "I could not bring myself to let her go. I kept thinking that if I just held on tight enough, she would wake up, that she would smile and say my name, just like she did every morning. But she never did." "And what about your father?" Celine asked, though she felt she already knew the answer. A darkness fell over Stellan's expression, and for the first time that evening, she saw the terrifying man that all of Chicago feared. "I killed him," he stated, his voice as cold as ice. "It was 2 years after that night. I was 19. I used those 2 years to plan, to become stronger, to become utterly ruthless. Then I used the same blade he had used on my mother to end his life. I stood and watched him die, and I felt absolutely nothing. No remorse, no fear, just a complete emptiness." He turned to face Celine, his eyes a conflicting storm of ice and fire. "That was the day I truly became a monster. That was the day a part of me died with Thistle, leaving behind what you see before you." Celine instinctively reached out and placed her hand over his. Stellan looked down at her fingers on his skin, a look of disbelief on his face, as if he could not fathom why she would still want to touch him after his confession. "You are not a monster," she said, her voice unwavering despite her own tears. "You were a 12-year-old boy left to raise your baby sister all on your own. You were a loving brother who lost his sister while trying to defend her. You were a son who sought justice for his mother and sister. That is not a monster, that is a survivor." Stellan stared at her for a long, quiet moment, and Celine thought she saw something change in his eyes. It was not much, just a tiny flicker of light piercing through all the darkness. "Fern looks at me like I am a good man," he said, the words sounding like a hushed confession. "She looks at me in the same way that Thistle used to, and I have no idea how to handle that." Celine squeezed his hand a little tighter. "You just keep on being the man that Fern sees," she told him. "That is all you need to do." And there in that room, filled with shadows and the soft glow of a yellow lamp, with Fern sleeping soundly between them, Celine witnessed something she imagined no one else ever had. A single tear traced a path down the cheek of Stellan Cross, and she understood that regardless of who he was or what he had done in his past, she could never turn her back on him. The world shifted on a Monday morning, precisely 2 weeks after the night Stellan had told Celine his story about Thistle. She was in her office, going over some documents from a recent meeting, when the door flew open and Kier rushed inside. Stellan's most trusted guard appeared as if he had just completed a marathon. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his eyes were filled with stress, and his jaw was set hard. "The boss requires your presence immediately," Kier said, his tone filled with urgency. Celine knew better than to ask questions. She simply rose and followed him to Stellan's office. The moment she entered, she felt the crushing weight of the atmosphere in the room. Stellan was behind his desk, flanked by 5 men she knew as his most trusted guards. The tension was a blade hanging in the air. Stellan's eyes found hers and held them. "Harlan Mercer," he said, and the name landed in the silence like an explosion. Celine recognized the name instantly. In the Chicago underworld, everyone knew of Harlan Mercer, the South Side Mafia boss and Stellan's bitter rival. His father was once an ally to Stellan's own, before Stellan murdered his father to seize the empire. Harlan had promised to have his revenge. For 20 years he waited, quietly amassing power. "And now he is making his move," Kier stated, taking a step forward. "Our intelligence confirms he has reached out to at least 3 other families in the Midwest: Detroit, Milwaukee, and Indianapolis. They are all weighing an alliance with him." "To do what?" Celine asked, though the answer was already a cold certainty in her gut. "To kill me," Stellan answered, his voice like ice. "Harlan has no interest in my territory. He wants me dead. He wants to wipe every person and everything connected to me off the face of the earth." Celine felt the warmth drain from her body, the blood in her veins turning to frost. Everything connected to him. That meant her. That meant Fern. "We are increasing security," Stellan announced, his gaze shifting to his guards. "Double the patrols on the perimeter. Nobody gets in or out without my direct authorization. And I want guards on Celine and Fern's apartment 24 hours a day." The men gave a sharp nod and moved out to execute their orders. Once they were alone, Celine moved toward Stellan. "I need to leave," she said, her tone far more stable than she felt. "If Harlan is targeting those close to you, Fern and I are a liability here. We make you vulnerable. We are your weakness." "No," Stellan said at once, his voice sharp and absolute. "You are not going anywhere." "Stellan, this is not a time for arguing." He closed the distance between them. He was so near she could trace the lines of the scar on his face, so close she could feel the heat rolling off his body. "Where do you honestly think you would be safer?" he demanded. "Out in the world alone with an 11-month-old baby? Or in this estate, the most fortified property in Chicago, with an entire army prepared to lay down their lives for you?" Celine wanted to fight back, to tell him she had managed to survive on her own for years. But she knew he was right. Against men like Harlan Mercer, she couldn't protect Fern. She could not even protect herself. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why do you care so much what happens to us? We are nothing. I am just a cleaner you took in. Because she looks at me as if I am a good man, Stellan interrupted. And for the very first time, Celine detected something in his voice besides cold command. Because you were the first person who shed a tear for me in 20 years. Because when I am with you and that child, I feel as if maybe, just maybe, I am not a complete monster. He raised a hand and gently touched her cheek, his touch as careful as it had been that night in Fern's room. You are not leaving, he stated, his tone a mixture of command and a desperate plea. You will stay here with me. Let me be the one to protect you and the child. Celine stared into his intense gray eyes and understood she could not say no. It was not because she was afraid of him, but because she did not want to leave. All right, she whispered. We will stay. And as Stellan gathered her into his arms, holding her like she was the most fragile and valuable thing he had ever known, Celine was certain that whatever happened next, she would not regret her choice. 3 days later, the traitor was found. Keir had discovered an anomaly while reviewing the estate's call logs. A strange number appeared repeatedly, linked to Corbin, a guard who had been with Stellan for 8 years. There were encrypted messages, calls placed at unusual hours, and large sums of money funneled into a secret offshore account. The proof was undeniable. Celine was forbidden from going anywhere near the basement where they were holding Corbin. Stellan made it clear she was to stay away, but she heard whispers from Mrs. Thornbury, who was still trembling after accidentally walking past the basement door that morning. The screaming, she whispered, all the color gone from her face. I have never in my life heard a person scream like that. Celine did not press for details. She did not want to know. But when Stellan came back to his office later that afternoon, she saw the dark stain of blood on his cuff. It was a stain he made no effort to hide. He stood with his back to her, staring out the window, silent for a full 10 minutes before he finally spoke. He confessed, Stellan said, his voice deep and weary. 3 months. He has been feeding Harlan information for 3 months. Celine swallowed, her throat tight. What did he tell him? Everything. Stellan turned to face her, and Celine saw a darkness in his eyes that was deeper than she had ever seen. My daily schedule, my meetings, my business strategies. He paused, his jaw tightening again. And he knows about you and the child. Celine felt a crushing weight settle on her heart. Harlan knows about us. He is aware of everything. Stellan began to walk toward her, and each step seemed laborious, as if he were carrying an immense burden. He knows this is where you live. He knows that Fern is my greatest vulnerability. He knows that I would do absolutely anything to keep you both safe, and he plans to use that knowledge against me. A wave of fear washed through Celine's chest. It was not a fear for her own safety. It was a fear for Fern. Her daughter was just 11 months old. She was innocent, knowing nothing of the criminal underworld, of brutal mafia wars, or of men who would murder a child to settle a score. What was Corbin's fate? She asked, though she could already guess the answer. Stellan looked at her, and his eyes held not a single trace of regret. He is no longer a problem. She gave a slight nod. She was not as shocked as she might have expected. Perhaps it was because she had always known who Stellan was. Or perhaps it was because she understood that in their world, the price of betrayal was always paid with blood. Or maybe it was because the very thought of someone selling information about her daughter to an enemy erased any feeling of mercy she might have had for the traitor. I will keep you both safe, Stellan vowed, taking her hand in his. I give you my word. Even if it means sacrificing my own life, I will not allow Harlan to lay a hand on you or the child. Celine looked deep into his eyes and saw the fierce determination blazing there. She knew he was telling the truth. She knew he would honor that promise. And that knowledge terrified her more than anything, because she could not bear the thought of him dying. She could not stand to lose him, not after everything, not when she felt like she had only just found him. Do not die for us, she pleaded, her voice cracking. You have to live. Live for Fern, and live for me. Stellan gazed at her for a long moment, and she saw a flicker of softness move across those hardened steel-gray eyes. He offered no words. He simply gathered her into his arms, holding her with a desperate tightness that felt like it could be their very last embrace. And Celine, held in the arms of a man who had taken lives with his own hands, finally realized she was no longer afraid of him. Her only fear was of losing him. 1 week after Corbin's betrayal, Stellan had to leave for a meeting with the Mafia leaders in Milwaukee. It was a negotiation intended to prevent them from forming an alliance with Harlan Mercer. Celine begged to come with him, but he flatly refused. "It is far too dangerous," he said. "You will stay here with Fern. I will be home before midnight." She did not protest, but sleep was impossible. She sat in the apartment's living room, her gaze locked on the door, marking the slow passage of every single minute. 10 o'clock came and went. Then 11 o'clock. There was no word. Her phone remained dark in her clenched fist when the apartment door finally swung open just before midnight. Celine leaped to her feet. Stellan walked in, and her heart plunged. There was blood on his shirt, staining the sleeve of his jacket and his neck. A long, deep cut ran the length of his left arm. Fresh blood was soaking through the torn fabric. Celine was at his side in an instant. "You are hurt. We have to get you to a hospital." "It is nothing more than a scratch," Stellan dismissed, his voice thick with fatigue. "The negotiation did not go as I had hoped. One of their men tried to prove his loyalty by drawing a knife." He added, "He is no longer in a position to regret that choice." Celine had no thoughts for the dead man. Her entire focus was on the man in front of her, bleeding and acting as if he were perfectly fine. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "Now." Stellan arched an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise on his face that she would dare to order him around, but he complied without a word. He sank onto the sofa, watching her with eyes that were heavy with exhaustion and something more, something she was afraid to name. Celine fetched the first aid supplies from the bathroom and came back. She sat next to him, gently peeling away his jacket and ripping the shirt sleeve to get a clear look at the injury. The cut was roughly 15 centimeters long. While not too deep, it would absolutely require stitches. She worked with focused silence, cleaning away the blood, applying antiseptic, and preparing the bandage. Her hands remained steady, a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of her heart. She had learned these skills in medical school, back in a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. She never imagined she would put them to use, certainly not on a mafia boss. "You are a stubborn woman," Stellan observed suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Celine glanced up, her eyes locking with his. He was observing her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It was soft, almost tender, as if he were looking at something incredibly precious. "I had a very good teacher," she answered, struggling to keep her own voice even as her pulse raced. Stellan did not smile. He simply continued to study her, his gray eyes searching her face. "You were worried about me," he said. It was not a question, it was a fact. Celine paused in her work and met his gaze directly. "Of course I was worried," she admitted, her voice softening. "Did you really think I would not be, when you walked alone into a den of wolves?" "Why?" "It's because I care about you," Celine admitted. For once, she made no effort to conceal the truth. "Because Fern depends on you. Because I depend on you. Because if you were hurt, I honestly do not know what I would do." The air hung thick with silence. Stellan watched her for what felt like an eternity, long enough for a deep blush to rise in her cheeks. It was long enough for the first whispers of regret to surface. He then raised his uninjured hand, touching her face with the same gentleness he had shown in Fern's room that very first night. "This is a mistake," he murmured, and Celine could feel the warmth of his breath near her lips. "You deserve so much better than a man like me." "I do not care about what I deserve," Celine retorted, her voice shaking with emotion. "Let me be the one to decide that." And then he leaned in and kissed her, a soft and careful touch, as if she were made of fragile glass. His lips felt so warm on hers, and in that moment, the entire world seemed to fade away. There was only the two of them, bathed in the apartment's golden glow, with the lingering metallic scent of blood and antiseptic still in the air. As he drew away, he rested his forehead against hers. His gray eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw something she finally had the courage to name. It was love. "I will keep you safe," he vowed in a whisper. "I would give my life for you." Celine's heart felt like it would burst from her chest. She pulled him back down, kissing him again. This was not a gentle kiss. It was filled with a desperate longing, a raw need, and every single emotion she had suppressed for so very long. She did not want him to die for her. She desperately needed him to live. Just to live. To keep holding her this way. To live. To keep kissing her like this. To live. And to look at her as though she was the only thing that mattered in his universe. All of this unfolded on a Tuesday evening. It was just 3 days after their first kiss. Celine was in Stellan's office, going over some contracts he wanted her to examine. Fern was sound asleep in their apartment, with Miss Hayashi watching over her. Stellan was seated at his desk, his intense gray eyes fixed on his laptop, but he would look up at her from time to time. They were just quick glances, accompanied by faint smiles that appeared and disappeared in an instant. These were tiny, private moments that belonged only to them. The last 3 days had passed in a beautiful, surreal haze. To everyone else, Stellan remained the same man, cold and utterly ruthless, but with her, he was completely transformed. A light brush of his fingers as they passed in the hall, a hurried kiss stolen in a deserted corridor, a look of profound tenderness when he believed she was not looking. Celine had no idea what they were building. She could not see where this path was leading them. All she knew was that she never wanted it to stop. She felt happy. For the very first time in so many years, she was experiencing true happiness. And that was the exact moment her world violently exploded. The sound arrived first. It was a piercing whistle that ripped through the air, like the sound of death itself taking a final breath. Then, the immense floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the office completely shattered. Shards of glass flew into the room like a hailstorm. Celine cried out, a pure instinct, raising her arms to protect her face. But she was not nearly fast enough. Stellan launched himself over his desk. His body crashed hard into hers, knocking her down to the floor as he shielded her completely with his own. Sharp pieces of glass cut deep into his back. She heard the sound of his shirt ripping and felt his entire body stiffen from the sheer agony. Yet he did not shift a single inch. He only held her more securely, pulling her in closer as he lowered his head, his mouth right next to her ear. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice strained through clenched teeth. "Do not move." A storm of gunfire broke out. It was not just one shot. There were dozens, coming from outside, from the courtyard down below, from every conceivable direction. The sounds of screams, frantic footsteps, and roaring engines filled the air. The entire estate was under siege. Stellan pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number without even looking at it. Hayashi. His voice was as cold as ever, even with blood streaming down his back. "Lock down the safe room immediately. Protect the child at all costs." He hung up and looked down at Celine, his gray eyes blazing in the dim light. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his tone low and urgent. "You are going to crawl to that door. You are going to run straight back to the apartment. You will go into the safe room with Fern. The access code is 0815. Can you remember that?" Celine managed a nod, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. "But what is going to happen to you?" "I will take care of this," Stellan answered. As he raised his head, a handgun seemed to materialize in his grasp from thin air. "Go, right now." "I cannot just leave you here by yourself," Celine said, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "I just cannot." "Yes, you can," Stellan interrupted, his gaze locking with hers. "You will do it for Fern. She needs you. She cannot afford to lose her mother." Fern. The name of her daughter was like a beacon, cutting through the dense fog of her terror. Her baby was in the apartment. She must be so frightened. She needed her mom. Go, Stellan repeated, and this time his voice softened, becoming as gentle as it was when he spoke to Fern. I will come and find you later. I give you my word. Celine wanted to respond. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, to plead with him to stay alive, to tell him she could not bear to lose him. But there was simply no more time. The gunfire was getting much closer now. The screams were spreading across the estate grounds, and Stellan was already rising to his feet. His back was a mess of blood, the gun was steady in his hand, and he was moving toward the ruined window. She heard his voice cut through the blackness outside, utterly cold and deadly. It was completely devoid of the man who had held her and kissed her just 3 nights ago. You have all just made the final mistake of your lives. Then the roar of gunfire intensified, and Celine began to crawl toward the door. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and her heart felt like it was breaking as she left him to face the danger alone. She ran through the corridors, the sharp glass on the floor slicing into her feet, her blood leaving trails on the polished marble. It did not matter. Her thoughts were only on Fern, on Stellan, and on the promise he had made. I will find you later. He had to keep that promise. He simply had to live, because if he were to die, she had no idea how she could possibly continue on at all. Celine ran with a speed she never knew she possessed. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, its lights flickering as the estate's power grid began to fail under the assault. Gunshots echoed from all around, punctuated by screams, the shattering of more glass, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. The entire estate had been turned into a war zone. She rounded the corner into the hallway. This one led to the east wing, where her apartment and her daughter were waiting. 50 meters to go, then 40, then 30. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks, as if she had run into a solid, invisible barrier. 2 men were blocking the path ahead. They were dressed entirely in black, with masks concealing their faces and guns held ready in their hands. And they were staring directly at her. There she is, one of them said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. The prize the boss is waiting for. A cold dread washed over Celine, turning her blood to ice. She took 1 step back, then another. But there was no escape. The long, empty corridor was behind her. In front of her stood 2 killers, sent by Harlan Mercer. She was completely trapped. Take her, the second man commanded. The boss wants her breathing, so keep her alive. They started to move toward her. Celine knew she had to act. She could not allow them to capture her. She could not let them use her as a weapon against Stellan. She absolutely could not let Fern lose her mother. Her eyes scanned the area frantically, searching for anything to use as a weapon. A decorative vase, a framed picture, anything at all. But before she could even make a move, a dark figure burst from the shadows behind her. It was Stellan. He moved like a phantom with incredible speed and deadly purpose. Before the 2 assailants even had a chance to react, he was already upon them. He delivered a sharp blow to the first man's throat. The man collapsed, gagging for air, his weapon clattering onto the marble floor. The second man fired his gun, but Stellan twisted away, the bullet only grazing his shoulder. He then seized the gunman's arm and wrenched it with brutal force. A dry, cracking sound echoed as the bones snapped. A scream was choked off into silence as Stellan used their own weapon to finish them both. 2 quick shots, and 2 bodies slumped to the ground. The entire encounter took less than 10 seconds. Celine just stood there, shaking, unable to fully grasp what she had just witnessed. She had always been aware that Stellan was a dangerous man. She had known he was capable of killing, but to see it happen right before her eyes was a completely different reality. He was savage. He was without mercy. He was like death itself given human form. And he had just ended 2 lives to keep her safe. "Run!" Stellan commanded, his voice surprisingly firm. He seized her hand and pulled her into a sprint. Blood flowed freely from his shoulder and from the wounds on his back, yet he showed no sign of slowing. They raced through the hallways, past the bodies that now littered the floor, past spreading pools of blood that were still warm on the cool marble. Celine refused to look. She kept her eyes locked on Stellan's back, on the strong hand that held hers, and she just ran. When they finally arrived at the apartment, the door was already ajar. Miss Hayashi stood just inside, holding a pistol in each hand, her expression shockingly calm. "Where is Fern?" Stellan demanded immediately. "In the safe room," Hayashi reported. "She is sleeping. I administered a mild sedative." Stellan pushed Celine toward the heavy steel door at the rear of the apartment. "The code," he said, reminding her. With fingers that trembled, Celine typed in the 4 digits. 0815. The door unlatched with a solid thud. Inside, Fern was lying on a small bed, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and peaceful. She was completely unaware of the nightmare that was unfolding just outside. She had no knowledge of the blood, the death, and the terrible violence happening around her. Celine hurried to her daughter's side, holding her close as tears flowed down her cheeks. Fern continued to sleep soundly, completely still. "Get inside," Stellan ordered Hayashi. "Protect them both." "And what about you?" Hayashi questioned. "I have some business to finish." Stellan then turned his attention to Celine. For a fleeting second, the icy mask on his face seemed to melt. All that was left was the man who had sung Fern to sleep, the one who had kissed her in the warm yellow light, the one who looked at her as if she was the center of his universe. "I will be back," he said. "That is a promise." Then the heavy steel door swung shut, and Celine could only sit there, holding her child, listening to the continuous sound of gunfire outside, and praying with all her might. "Please let him live," she whispered into Fern's soft hair. "Please let him come back for us." 20 minutes went by, but it felt like 20 years. Every single gunshot felt like a knife twisting in Celine's heart. Every scream she heard was a curse. She had no way of knowing what was happening beyond that steel door. No way to know if Stellan was alive or if he was dead. No idea if the room would be enough to keep them safe. All she could do was hold on and listen to the silence. One moment, the world was gunfire and screams. The next, it was gone. An oppressive quiet settled in the room, weighing on Celine's chest like a stone. She huddled in the corner of the secure space, clutching Fern tightly as her gaze remained fixed on the heavy steel door. Ms. Hayashi stood guard before it, weapon still raised, her body coiled and ready for a threat. No one made a sound. No one even breathed too deeply. Then they heard footsteps. They were slow and heavy, dragging as they neared. Celine's arms tightened around Fern, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had no idea who was approaching. It could be Stellan, or it could be one of his rivals. She did not know if that door was about to open on a savior or an executioner. 3 distinct knocks echoed on the metal. A man's voice followed, low, ragged and drained, but unmistakably alive. "Open the door. It is me." The relief hit Celine so hard she was sobbing before she knew it. She laid Fern carefully on the bed and stumbled forward, her hands trembling as she reached for the lock. The door swung inward to reveal Stellan. He looked as if he had clawed his way back from the grave. He was covered in blood. It stained his clothes, his face, his hands, and his hair. A deep gash above his eye was bleeding freely. His shoulder was a mess of torn fabric and visible raw muscle. The expensive suit he wore was now nothing more than ruined rags. But he was on his feet. He was breathing. He was here. "Stellan." Celine launched herself into his embrace, ignoring the slick wetness of blood, ignoring everything but the fact that he was real, he was alive, and he had come back to her just as he promised he would. Stellan's arms locked around her, holding her with a crushing force. His entire frame was shaking. It was not from the chill or his injuries, but from an emotion she had never witnessed in him. "I am so sorry," he rasped into her hair, his voice cracking. "This is my world. This danger is mine. It is all my fault. You should never have endured this. Fern should not have." She gently placed her fingers on his lips to quiet him. "We are okay. You kept us safe. You saved us. I am the reason you were in danger. No. Harlan Mercer was the one who put us in danger, and I have a feeling he is no longer a problem. For a fleeting second, Stellan's eyes went dark. No, he is not a problem anymore. His expression then softened as his gaze shifted to the small bed across the room. Fern was sitting up. Her wide blue eyes were fixed on the blood-soaked man who filled the doorway. Celine worried that Fern would be terrified, that the sight of him in this state would make her scream. He was covered in blood and wounds, carrying the shadow of death itself. But Fern did not scream. Instead, she slid off the bed and walked on unsteady legs toward Stellan, her little arms reaching up to him. He bent down and lifted her, ignoring the pain from his bleeding arm and the profound exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. Fern wrapped her arms around his neck, just like she always did, resting her cheek against his shoulder. Then she leaned back, her tiny face creased with worry as she looked at the cut on his forehead. And then she said her first word, "Aoi." A single word, spoken with perfect clarity. Celine went still. Miss Hayashi froze in place. It felt as if the entire world had paused. Fern reached out a tiny finger and touched the wound on Stellan's forehead. Her touch was gentle and careful, as though she was afraid of causing him more pain. "Owie," she repeated, her voice filled with concern. "Hurt?" Stellan looked down at the small child cradled in his arms, and at that moment, Celine witnessed something she had believed to be impossible. Tears began to slide down Stellan Cross's face. The man who had likely ended more lives than she could count that very night was now weeping because a little girl of 11 months had just spoken. "Her first word," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Her first word is Owie." "Owie," Fern said again, patting his cheek in a clear attempt to comfort him. "Owie." Stellan pulled her closer, squeezing his eyes shut as more tears fell. He made no effort to hide them. He did not try to appear strong. He simply stood there, a broken and bloodied man, holding a child who was not his own but who loved him unconditionally, and he let himself cry. "I am okay, little one," he managed to whisper. "I am okay." Celine moved in, wrapping her arms around them both. They remained there together inside the steel safe room, where the air was thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder, as the faint sound of sirens began to rise in the distance. They were a family, battered, bloody, and imperfect, but a family nonetheless. "Stay with me," Stellan said, his voice sounding like a desperate prayer. "Both of you, please stay with me. Let me be the one who protects you. Let me love you. Let me be more than just a monster." Celine tilted her face up to his, looking directly into eyes that were swimming with tears and pain and a fragile new hope. "You already are," she told him softly. "You have been for a very long time. You just were not able to see it." Fern tightened her little arms around both of their necks, as if she would never let them go. "Owie," she said one more time, and then a bright smile broke across her face. "All better?" And though Celine had no idea where Fern had learned that phrase or how she could possibly understand its meaning, she knew with absolute certainty that the words were for Stellan. "It hurts right now, but it is going to be all right. Everything is going to be all right." 6 months later, the Chicago summer air was warm and carried a gentle breeze. The vast gardens of the Cross estate were blooming with roses and lavender, their sweet perfume hanging in the air. Celine stood on the veranda, taking in a peaceful scene she never would have imagined could be part of her life just half a year ago. "She is running," she called out, a brilliant smile lighting up her face. Fern, now 17 months old, was making her way across the perfectly green lawn. Her small legs were a little wobbly, but she moved with determination. 2 tiny braids bounced with each determined step. Her joyous laughter sounded like chimes in the wind. She was no longer the frail and pale baby from before. Her cheeks had a healthy, rosy color. A vibrant light sparkled in her eyes. her health had blossomed under proper care and love. "I have got you now." Stellan emerged from behind a rose bush, leaning down to sweep Fern up into his arms. He spun her around in the air, and Fern's laughter exploded with pure delight. It was the most beautiful sound Solene had ever heard. On this day, Stellan was dressed in jeans and a plain white shirt, a world away from the costly suits he wore to his meetings. The scar on his face was a permanent reminder of that night. The wound on his forehead had healed into a thin line, but his eyes were completely transformed. They were no longer cold as ice or empty like a void. Now, there was a light inside them. There was life. There was so much love. "Daddy!" Fern shouted, patting her hands on Stellan's cheeks. "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" Stellan froze for a moment. Even after hearing that word for the past month since she first started saying it, he never seemed to get used to it. Every single time, his eyes would grow misty. Every single time, he held her just a little bit closer. "She calls me Dad," he said to Solene, his voice filled with wonder as she joined them. "She calls you Dad because that is who you are to her," Solene answered, putting her arms around both of them. "You are her dad in every single way that counts." Stellan looked at her then, and his gaze said everything his words could not. It held gratitude, love, and a deep devotion. It was a silent vow that he would defend them with his very last breath. He was, of course, still Stellan Cross, the phantom who commanded Chicago's underworld. He was still a dangerous man, still merciless with his enemies. But for the two people in his arms, he was someone entirely different. He was a father. He was a partner. He was a man finally learning how to truly live after 20 years of simply existing. Fern clapped her hands against both Stellan and Solene, a wide grin on her face. Daddy, Mommy, love. 3 little words. But inside them, they held an entire universe. The 3 of them laughed together, standing in the sun-filled garden, holding on to each other and laughing. They were a family forged not from blood, but from choice, from love, and from the powerful idea that every person is worthy of being saved. Sometimes, the brightest light can emerge from the very darkest of places. Sometimes, redemption arrives in the small, trusting hands of a child. And sometimes, monsters do not have to be slain, they just need to be loved. Today's story concludes here, but its lesson will stay with us. In our lives, we may find that the people who appear the most formidable are often the ones who need love the most. Sometimes, a heart that seems to have been frozen for years can be thawed by the innocent trust in a child's eyes. And sometimes, our true family is discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it so that more people can enjoy meaningful stories each day. What emotions did this story bring up for you? Have you ever known someone who seemed cold and distant, only to discover a warm and caring heart inside? We would love for you to share your experiences in the comments section below. We are always eager to hear the thoughts that come from the depths of your heart. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a life filled with joy, and many peaceful, happy days surrounded by the people you hold dear. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in our next video. This content was carefully researched, crafted, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our journey.